A couple vanished in 1969, and 55 years later, their car was found in the river. For generations, this town carried the story like a shadow. Two young people, full of promise, who left a diner late one summer night and were never seen again. Theories spread. Searches turned up nothing. Families aged while waiting for answers that never came. It became one of those stories people repeated in hushed tones, not just a mystery, but a wound that never healed. And then, on an unremarkable afternoon decades later, the river gave up its secret. The car was barely visible when they first noticed it beneath the water. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a rock, or maybe a fallen log swallowed by time and current. But as the sunlight cut deeper through the rippling surface, it revealed something unnatural. Rust, steel, the skeleton of a vehicle resting on its side, buried in mud. When crews finally pulled it out, the air grew heavy with silence. 55 years of water and sediment clung to the battered frame. Mud poured from the wheel wells, windows shattered with the pressure. And inside there were the remains of two people who had been missing for half a century. The mystery was no longer folklore. It was real, tangible, right there on the riverbank. But to understand what this discovery meant, to feel the weight of it, we need to go back. Back to 1969. Back to the last night anyone saw Michael and Susan alive. The late 60s were years of contradiction. On the nightly news, images of war and protest flashed across grainy black and white screens. But in small towns tucked into the American Midwest, life had its own rhythm, separate from the chaos of the outside world. Downtown was a single strip of shops, a diner with chrome bar stools and red vinyl booths, a pharmacy with a soda fountain, a barber shop where men gathered to trade gossip under the hum of a ceiling fan. The summer air smelled like cut grass and gasoline, drifting in from the fields and the cars that lined up at the local drive-in theater. And for the town's teenagers, nights meant freedom. They piled into Chevys and Fords, radios blaring Creedence Clearwater Revival or The Supremes, headlights cutting across back roads lined with cornfields. People gathered at the riverbank to drink cheap beer, pass cigarettes, and watch the stars. It was a world small enough to feel safe until it wasn't. Michael and Susan fit perfectly into this landscape. Michael, 20 years old, was known as the kind of boy who could make a car engine sing. He worked afternoons at his uncle's hardware store, saving every paycheck, and spent nights under the hood of his Chevy Impala, the pale blue one he bought secondhand but polished until it gleamed. He was restless in a way that everyone recognized. Small-town life wasn't enough for him, not forever. He wanted something bigger, though no one knew exactly what. Susan, just 18, had graduated high school that spring. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but people noticed her. She had a laugh that carried, a quick wit, and a kindness that made people trust her. Friends said she dreamed of going to college in the city, maybe studying nursing, but she hadn't decided yet. For now, she was working at the library part-time, saving her money and spending her weekends with Michael. Together, they were inseparable. Not flashy, not dramatic. Just steady, the way some couples seem meant to be. They shared milkshakes at the diner. They sat through double features at the drive-in, the windows fogging up from their whispered conversations. They drove nowhere in particular, just happy to be side by side. That's why what happened to them rattled the town so deeply. They weren't the kind of kids anyone expected to vanish. The night it happened, August 23rd, 1969, started like so many others. It was hot and humid, the kind of night where the air stuck to your skin. At the diner, the ceiling fan spun lazily above crowded booths. The jukebox played something soft in the background, maybe The Temptations, maybe something by the Beatles. Michael and Susan slid into their usual booth, ordered fries, and laughed with friends who drifted in and out. People remembered Susan teasing Michael for pouring half the ketchup bottle onto his plate. They remembered Michael joking back, his grin as wide as the night was long. Nothing about the evening seemed unusual. Around 10 o'clock, they stood to leave. They said their goodbyes, waved to friends, and walked out into the thick summer night. A few boys leaning against cars in the parking lot whistled at them, calling out playful remarks. Michael shot back something smart, making Susan laugh as she tugged his arm toward the Impala. The sound of the car starting up echoed across Main Street. The headlights cut away into the dark, and then, nothing. That was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. By morning, the first hints of worry set in. Susan's bed hadn't been slept in. Michael hadn't come home either. At first, Their families tried to stay calm. Teenagers sometimes stretched curfews, and couples sometimes disappeared for a night. But as the hours passed, unease turned to panic. Phone calls were made, friends were questioned. By evening, both families had reported them missing. The police response was lukewarm. In 1969, missing teenagers, especially couples, were often brushed off. Maybe they'd run away. Maybe they'd eloped. Maybe they were just out having fun and didn't want to be found. Officers said as much, telling parents to wait a few days. But the families knew better. Susan would never vanish without telling her mother. Michael wouldn't skip shifts at the hardware store, and neither of them had much money to run away with. Something was wrong, and by the next night, the entire town felt it too. The search began almost immediately. Deputies combed the back roads, farmers checked their fields, neighbors peered into barns and sheds. Volunteers walked along the riverbank with flashlights, their beams slicing through the dark. Nothing. The Impala was gone. Michael and Susan were gone. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Rumors started almost instantly. Some whispered about foul play, a robbery, a jealous ex, strangers passing through town. Others clung to the idea that maybe the couple had chosen to run, that maybe they were out there somewhere starting fresh. But deep down, most people didn't believe it. In a town that small, secrets didn't stay hidden long, and yet this one did. For decades, the story lingered like a ghost. Families refused to give up, but as years stretched on, hope thinned. Theories grew wilder. Suspects were whispered about, then cleared, then whispered about again. The case hardened into legend, the kind of tale kids dared each other to talk about on dark nights. But then, half a century later, the river decided to speak. And when it did, the truth was as heartbreaking as it was inevitable. When people tell the story of Michael and Susan today, it almost sounds like something from a song, a pair of young sweethearts caught in time, frozen on the edge of adulthood. To understand why their disappearance carved such a deep wound in the town, you have to see them as they were, not as the mystery they became. Michael had grown up just a few blocks from Main Street, the middle child of three. His father worked long days at the factory. His mother took in sewing to stretch the family income, and Michael filled the space in between with his easy charm and restless energy. He was known for his car before anything else, that Chevy Impala he bought used but treated like treasure. People said he could take it apart and put it back together again, and sometimes he did just that, just to prove he could. When he wasn't under the hood of the car, he was at the hardware store. His uncle owned it, and Michael put in hours after school and on weekends. He was good with customers, always ready with a grin or a story. But those close to him said he was looking beyond the town limits. He talked about saving money, about one day heading west, maybe California. Out there, the world felt bigger, brighter. Susan, on the other hand, was deeply rooted in the town. She lived with her mother in a small, neatly kept house on the edge of town, the kind with lace curtains in the windows and a front porch swing that creaked when the summer breeze picked up. Her father had passed away when she was little, so she and her mother leaned on each other. Neighbors described them as close, more like sisters at times than mother and daughter. Susan was the kind of girl who made people feel at ease. At school, she was never the loudest, but she was remembered. Teachers called her dependable, friends called her kind, and boys noticed her in a quiet, respectful way. She wasn't flashy, but she had a confidence that made people pay attention. That summer, she was working part-time at the library, stacking books and helping children with summer reading lists. She'd been accepted to a nearby college, though she hadn't yet decided if she'd go. Together, Michael and Susan were steady. They weren't the couple who fought loudly in the diner parking lot or who disappeared for weeks on end in a blaze of drama. They were the couple you saw walking hand in hand, sharing fries, leaning against the hood of the Impala while talking about everything and nothing. The summer of 1969 was hot, even by Midwestern standards. Days stretched long and heavy, the air humming with cicadas, and the smell of cornfields ripening under the Sunday nights were for escape. Teenagers packed into cars and headed to the drive-in, where double features played under the stars and the lot buzzed with radios. Couples lingered on the riverbank, windows rolled down, the sound of water mingling with laughter. That summer felt endless, the kind people remembered for years. Woodstock had just happened, and though that was 1,000 miles away, its spirit drifted into even the smallest towns. Young people were restless, caught between the lives their parents expected and the world they wanted to create for themselves. Some whispered about heading to the city, others dreamed of California or New York, but most stayed. Most kept living in the rhythms of small-town life. For Michael and Susan, those rhythms were simple. He picked her up in the Impala after her shifts at the library. They drove to the diner, where the waitress already knew their order. They stayed late at the drive-in, the glow of the screen flickering across their faces. Sometimes they parked by the river, talking for hours about what the future might hold. Friends remembered their laughter more than anything. Susan's was quick and bright, and Michael's came slower, like he was trying to hold it back before it finally broke free. Together, their happiness seemed effortless. And maybe that's why what happened to them felt so cruel. It wasn't just that two young people disappeared. It was that the picture of them, Michael's hand on the wheel, Susan's head tilted as she listened, seemed so ordinary, so familiar, so safe. They were the kind of couple people rooted for, the kind whose absence left an emptiness no one could quite explain. The town itself wasn't large, a few thousand people, surrounded by farmland and connected by winding back roads. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than newsprint, and where disappearances weren't supposed to happen. Children grew up riding bikes down Main Street, past the diner, the drugstore, the barber shop. Parents left doors unlocked, strangers stood out. And in a town like that, Michael and Susan weren't just another pair of kids. They were our kids, as the older folks liked to say. That was the lens through which everyone saw them. When they disappeared, it wasn't only the families who grieved. It was the whole community, suddenly realizing that maybe their little corner of the world wasn't as safe as they thought. On August 23, 1969, Michael and Susan went about their day like any other. Michael worked a shift at the hardware store, clocking out in the late afternoon. Susan spent the day helping at the library, shelving returns, and chatting with children about their summer reading. By evening, both had returned home, freshened up, and met at the diner for their usual night out. No one knew, as they sat in that booth sharing fries and laughter, that it would be the last time anyone saw them alive. That's the tragedy of hindsight, knowing the weight of a moment after it's gone. The town didn't realize it that night. The families didn't realize it the next morning. But eventually, everyone would come to understand. Michael and Susan's lives ended not in a blaze of rebellion, but in the quiet stillness of a summer night, swallowed by a mystery that would stretch across generations. The night of August 23, 1969, began like any other summer night. The air was thick with heat, clinging even after the sun dipped below the horizon. Streetlights flickered on along Main Street, their halos catching moths that spun endlessly in the glow. Radios hummed through open car windows, and laughter spilled from the diner's door every time someone came or went. Inside, Michael and Susan sat in their usual booth. The red vinyl was cracked at the seams, patched with tape, but it was theirs. They shared a plate of fries, Susan dipping hers in just enough ketchup, Michael drowning his in the red sauce until Susan wrinkled her nose. Friends drifted by their table, sliding in for a few minutes of chatter before moving on. People remembered them smiling. Susan had her chin propped in her hand, her dark hair falling forward as she listened to Michael tell a story. Michael leaned across the table, gesturing with his fry like it was a conductor's baton. The jukebox played something soft in the background, maybe Smokey Robinson, maybe the Beatles. Everyone remembered it differently, but all agreed the atmosphere felt normal, ordinary. By 10 o'clock, the couple stood to leave. They waved goodbye to friends, Susan tugging her purse strap over her shoulder. Out in the parking lot, the air smelled faintly of gasoline and fried food. A few boys loitered by their cars, leaning against hoods, laughing and joking. Someone whistled at Susan as she passed, not unkindly but with the teasing bravado of small-town teenagers. Michael shot back a grin, tossing some remark that made Susan laugh as she pulled him toward the Impala. The car was hard to miss, pale blue, polished to a shine, with chrome bumpers that caught the glow of the diner lights. Michael took care of it like it was part of him. He opened the driver's door with a flourish, slipped behind the wheel, and with the turn of the key, the engine purred to life. Susan slid in beside him. A moment later, the Impala rolled out of the lot, taillights glowing red before fading into the night. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. The roads out of town were narrow, winding through farmland and patches of woods. In daylight, they seemed harmless gravel crunching under tires, fields of corn stretching endlessly on either side. But at night, they turned into black ribbons with no end in sight. Headlights cut a path only a few feet ahead, and beyond that was nothing but dark. Where Michael and Susan went that night, no one could say for certain. Some believed they planned to head to the river, like so many couples did. Others thought maybe they were just driving, killing time, talking about the future. Maybe Michael wanted to show Susan something he was working on with the car. Or maybe, and this is what haunted people most, maybe they never got where they were going. The town wasn't big, but there were countless places a car could vanish. Dirt roads leading nowhere, bridges with loose guardrails, curves sharper than they looked in the dark. And then there was the river, always the river, winding like a serpent just beyond the edge of town. By dawn, both families noticed the absence. Susan's mother rose early, as she always did, and walked past her daughter's room. The bed was still neatly made, untouched. A knot formed in her chest. Susan never stayed out all night without telling her. Michael's parents waited up longer, but when the clock ticked past 2 a.m, they went to bed, assuming he'd come in quietly later. By sunrise, when they checked his room and found it empty, worry started to grow. At first, they tried to reason it out. Maybe the couple had gone to a friend's house. Maybe they'd stayed at the river until late. Maybe they'd fallen asleep in the car. But as hours passed, those excuses wore thin. Phone calls were made. Friends were asked. No one had seen them since the diner. By afternoon, fear was gnawing at both families. When the couple was reported missing, police didn't react with urgency. 2 young people in love disappearing wasn't exactly rare. Officers suggested they might have run away together, eloped, or simply gone off to the city to start fresh. After all, it was the 60s. Kids were leaving their hometowns all the time, chasing freedom and rebellion. But the families knew. Susan would never have left without telling her mother. She didn't have money saved, didn't even have a suitcase packed. Michael had responsibilities, shifts at the hardware store he'd never miss, not to mention a younger brother who idolized him. No, they hadn't run away. Something had happened. That night, the search began. Neighbors gathered with flashlights, sweeping along the roadsides. Deputies drove slowly along country lanes, their headlights catching nothing but dust and trees. Farmers walked their fields, eyes scanning for tire tracks or broken fences. And then there was the river. Volunteers dragged sections of it with boats and hooks, hoping, fearing, to find the Impala sunk beneath the current. But the water was high that summer, the current strong. Days of searching turned up nothing. The car was gone. The couple was gone. It was as if they'd driven into the night and simply vanished. The days that followed were heavy with silence. The diner booth they always sat in sat empty. The Impala's absence was louder than any engine could have been. Families huddled together, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. People started whispering. Some said foul play, that someone had followed them that night, maybe an angry ex, maybe a stranger passing through town. Others clung to the idea that maybe they really had run away, though deep down, they didn't believe it. The town wasn't used to mysteries. It wasn't used to fear. But with every day that passed without answers, the unease grew. And somewhere, out there in the dark, the Impala rested beneath the river, holding its secret. The first 24 hours felt like a blur. At first, everyone told themselves it was nothing. Michael and Susan would walk through the door any minute. Maybe they'd stayed out late at the river. Maybe the Impala had broken down on some back road, and they'd had to walk for help. Maybe, just maybe, they were out being young and reckless, stretching the edges of freedom the way teenagers sometimes did. But by the second morning, that fragile hope had collapsed. Susan's mother called every friend she could think of. No one had seen her daughter since the night at the diner. Michael's parents did the same, reaching out to coworkers, to relatives, even to old-school friends who lived in nearby towns. Nothing. It was as if the couple had vanished into thin air. And then the questions began. Where had they been heading? Who had seen them last? Did they have plans that no one knew about? The answers circled back to the same place, the diner. That was where the trail ended. 2 young people walking out the door, laughing, heading to the parking lot. After that, nothing but silence. The police, still unconvinced of foul play, were slow to react. A patrol car was sent to check the usual spots: the riverbank, the drive-in lot, the roads leading in and out of town. They found nothing. By the 3rd day, the families had had enough. They organized their own search. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers joined in. Dozens of people walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, the hot sun beating down as they combed through tall grass and weeds. Others pushed through the woods, calling out names that only the birds seemed to answer. Farmers brought out tractors, checking fence lines, scanning for any sign of tire tracks. The river, dark and restless, became a focal point. Boats dragged hooks through the current, pulling up nothing but weeds and branches. Men waded into the shallows with poles, their boots sinking into the mud. Women stood on the banks with binoculars, eyes straining for a glimmer of pale blue metal beneath the water. Every splash, every ripple felt like a possibility, but the impala never appeared. The atmosphere in town shifted quickly. At first, people whispered theories in hushed tones. By the end of the week, the whispers had turned into open speculation. Some believed the couple had run away. The late 60s were full of stories like that, kids abandoning small-town life to chase something bigger. But anyone who knew Michael and Susan doubted it. They didn't have the money, didn't have a plan, didn't even have overnight bags packed. Others suggested foul play. Maybe someone had followed them out of the diner that night. Maybe they'd picked up a hitchhiker, something that was common then but came with risk. Some even suggested an accident, that the impala had gone off a curve, plunged into the river, swallowed whole by water and mud. But no matter how many rumors swirled, no matter how many theories took shape, there was still no evidence. The car was gone, the couple was gone, and the silence was deafening. Susan's mother refused to let go of hope. She left the porch light on every night, convinced that if Susan came home, she should be welcomed by light instead of darkness. Michael's father drove miles of back roads every evening after his shifts at the factory, headlights scanning ditches, praying for some sign, any sign, of the car. Weeks turned into months. Flyers went up on telephone poles. Newspapers printed their photos, urging anyone with information to come forward. A few tips trickled in. Someone thought they saw the impala on a back road. Someone else claimed to have spotted a couple matching their description at a gas station in another county. But every lead fizzled out. The families aged in fast motion. Nights blurred into days of searching. Days blurred into the quiet grief of waiting. The weight of not knowing pressed down heavier than anything else. The community rallied at first. Volunteers brought food to the searching families. Church groups organized vigils, candles flickering in the warm evening air. But as time dragged on, life in the town crept forward. The rhythm of small-town living reasserted itself. Kids went back to school, farmers harvested fields, the diner filled with laughter again. And yet, there was always that empty booth, always that lingering question. Where did Michael and Susan go? Theories multiplied as the months passed. Some pointed fingers at people in town, a jealous ex, a man with a reputation for drinking too much and losing his temper, someone harboring a secret no one dared to speak aloud. Others looked outward. Maybe the couple had been victims of a stranger, someone just passing through. The lack of answers made the possibilities endless, and each possibility carried its own kind of fear. The police dragged parts of the river again that fall, but with the current strong and the water deep, they came up empty. No broken guardrails, no skid marks. Nothing to suggest the car had gone off the road. It was as if the impala had been erased. By the end of the year, the case had gone cold. Michael and Susan's photos yellowed on the missing posters. The families kept searching, but the official investigation slowed to a crawl. Officers said they had no evidence of foul play, no crime scene, no suspects. Without leads, there was nothing to chase. But the families never stopped. Michael's younger brother grew up scanning every blue impala he saw, wondering if it might be the car. Susan's mother kept her daughter's room exactly as it was, as though waiting for her to come home. The grief didn't fade. It just shifted, turned inward, became part of the fabric of their lives. For the rest of the town, the disappearance became a kind of ghost story. Parents warned their children not to drive the back roads late at night. Teenagers dared each other to walk near the river after dark. Some swore they heard strange noises by the water or saw headlights flicker in the trees when no car was there. The line between reality and rumor blurred, and in that blur, the mystery of Michael and Susan only grew larger, heavier, more haunting. When two people disappear without a trace, the silence doesn't stay silent for long. It fills with whispers. It fills with theories. And for Michael and Susan, the void left behind became a breeding ground for every possibility imaginable. In the first weeks, the theories were practical. Some said it had to be an accident. The roads out of town were narrow, winding, and poorly lit. Maybe the Impala missed a curve, skidded on gravel, and plunged into the river. People pointed to the old bridge on Miller's Road, where the guardrail had been rusting for years. A sharp turn there could have easily sent the car straight into the water. But there was no broken railing, no skid marks, no sign of a car leaving the road, and when the river was dragged, nothing surfaced. Others suggested they'd run away. It was the 60s after all. Kids were leaving home in droves, chasing rebellion, chasing freedom. Maybe Michael and Susan had decided to start fresh somewhere new. California, New York, even just the next town over. But their families never believed it. Michael left his paycheck behind, and Susan didn't take so much as a change of clothes. They vanished with nothing but themselves and the clothes they were wearing. That wasn't running away. That was something else. As weeks stretched into months, the theories grew darker. Some whispered about foul play. Maybe someone had followed them out of the diner. Maybe they'd picked up a hitchhiker. Hitchhiking was common then, part of the culture, but it came with risk. There were already rumors of drifters robbing people along highways, stories of strangers who weren't what they seemed. One rumor pointed to a man who'd been drinking heavily at the bar the night Michael and Susan vanished. He had a reputation for violence when he was drunk, and some claimed he left the bar around the same time the couple was last seen. Police questioned him, but without evidence, nothing stuck. Another rumor focused on a jealous ex-boyfriend of Susan's. He'd been seen arguing with her a few weeks earlier, red-faced and shouting in the school parking lot. Some said he never quite got over her. He too was questioned. He denied everything. No charges were ever filed. As the months dragged on without answers, the theories drifted further from reality. One psychic called the family, claiming to have seen the car in a vision buried under brush in a field. Volunteers searched the spot. Nothing. Another psychic swore the couple had been taken to another state, that they were alive and waiting to be found. That lead, too, fizzled out. And then there were the whispers that bordered on folklore. Some said the river was cursed, that it had swallowed the car whole, refusing to give it back. Teenagers dared each other to drive the back roads at night, to park near the water and listen for voices. Some claimed they heard crying. Others swore they saw headlights flicker in the trees where no road existed. It was the kind of talk that blurred the line between grief and ghost story. The newspapers played their part too. Headlines shifted from hopeful to grim. At first, they printed smiling photos of the couple, urging readers to call police with any information. Later, they ran stories about the search dragging on with no results. Eventually, the case slipped to the back pages, just another unsolved mystery. But in town, the story never really went away. At the diner, people avoided the booth where Michael and Susan had sat that last night. At church, their names lingered on prayer lists. At school, younger kids whispered their story like a cautionary tale. And at night, parents told their teenagers not to stay out too late, not to drive the back roads, not to end up like Michael and Susan. The couple had become both a tragedy and a warning. The families clung to any lead, no matter how small. A blue car spotted in another county, a girl who looked like Susan at a gas station 2 towns over, a rumor of a fight in a bar miles away. Every time, they chased it. Every time, it ended in disappointment. The police, with no evidence and no suspects, slowly backed away. Their presence in the case grew thinner, their updates vaguer. It wasn't malice, just fatigue. Without proof of foul play, they had nothing to go on. And so the case hardened into silence. By the end of that first year, Michael and Susan's disappearance was less an open investigation and more a haunting absence. Families still searched, friends still remembered. But officially, there was nothing left to pursue. That's when the strangest theory of all began to surface, not in newspapers, not in official reports, but in whispers traded between friends late at night. What if they had been taken? Not by a stranger, not by an ex, not even by the river. What if they had been taken by something else entirely? The late 60s were a time of strange stories, UFO sightings, government cover-ups, secret cults. And in a town desperate for answers, some people began to wonder if Michael and Susan had stumbled into something bigger than themselves. It was a theory no one could prove, but one that never fully went away. Even decades later, long after the families had grown old and the case had gone cold, there were still those who whispered, maybe it wasn't an accident, maybe it wasn't foul play, maybe it was something we'll never understand. Time has a way of dulling sharp edges. Even the deepest wounds scab over. But when it came to Michael and Susan, the years didn't bring healing. They brought something worse: silence. By 1970, the search had slowed to a trickle. Flyers yellowed on telephone poles, their corners curling in the wind. The Impala, once polished to a gleam, lived only in memory. And the families, who once clung to hope that their children would walk through the front door, now found themselves staring at that door in long stretches of emptiness. For Susan's mother, grief became ritual. Every night, she left the porch light on. At first, it was a beacon, a sign for Susan, a way home. Later, it became something else. A habit. A prayer. A silent acknowledgement that the door should always stay open, even when her daughter never walked through it. Michael's father took to driving the back roads long after the police had given up. He'd finish his shift at the factory, eat in silence at the dinner table, and then slip out into the night. His headlights swept across ditches, fields, tree lines. He was convinced the car had gone off a road somewhere, that if he just looked in the right place, he'd find it, but he never did. Michael's younger brother, just a boy when the disappearance happened, grew up under the shadow of it. Every blue Impala that passed on the highway made his heart leap. Every unfamiliar face in town sparked the question, could it be them? Could it be her? Could it be him? In the town, the disappearance faded into background noise. At first, people spoke about it constantly at the diner, at church, in grocery store aisles. But as the months became years, life pulled people back to their own concerns. Crops still had to be planted, kids still had to be raised. The world outside still churned with war, protests, and change. By the mid-70s, new faces had moved to town who didn't even know the story. For them, Michael and Susan were just names, whispered occasionally, shadows in a past that wasn't theirs. But for the families, time didn't blur the edges. It sharpened them. Every birthday missed, every holiday spent in silence, every empty chair at the dinner table cut deeper than the last. Grief doesn't sit still. It shifts. For Susan's mother, grief hardened into a kind of stubbornness. She refused to move from the house, refused to redecorate Susan's room. The bed stayed made, the books on the shelf untouched, a sweater still hanging over the chair where Susan had left it. Visitors said it felt like stepping into a time capsule, as though Susan might walk in at any moment. For Michael's parents, grief became distance. His mother withdrew, quieting in a way that frightened people who once knew her as vibrant. His father grew angrier, snapping at small things, carrying the weight of guilt he never spoke aloud. Did he fail to protect his son? Could he have done more? That question haunted him until his death. The years without answers also created space for rumors to fester. Every so often, a story would resurface. Someone claimed they saw Susan in another state. Someone swore they spotted Michael's Impala on a back road. One year, a caller told police the car was buried in a quarry outside town. Another time, a drifter was picked up in a nearby county with a story that sounded too close to the truth to ignore. Each lead was chased, each one collapsed into nothing. And with each collapse, the families sank deeper into despair. By the 80s, the case was nearly forgotten by everyone but those who loved them. Technology was changing, computers entering police stations, DNA becoming a tool, but Michael and Susan's file sat gathering dust. Without a crime scene, without evidence, there was nothing for modern tools to solve. The world moved on. The hairstyles, the music, the politics all shifted with time. But in one corner of the Midwest, two families stayed stuck in 1969, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. Every anniversary of their disappearance brought a flicker of renewed attention. A newspaper might run a short piece, a local TV station might interview the aging families. But after the cameras left, the silence returned. One year, a psychic appeared on television, claiming to know where the car was. The families, desperate, begged investigators to check. Nothing was found. Another year, hunters reported finding bones in the woods. Animal remains, not human. Each false start reopened the wound. Each letdown deepened the ache. The passage of time is cruelest in how it steals not only the person, but the life they might have lived. Susan's mother grew old, waiting for a daughter who never came home. Michael's younger brother grew into a man without the sibling who should have been there to guide him. Weddings happened, children were born, milestones passed, all with the empty space of two people who should have been there. And through it all, the river kept its secret. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Michael and Susan's disappearance was no longer front-page news. For most of the town, it wasn't even a topic of conversation. A new generation had grown up who didn't remember the summer of '69. They hadn't sat in that diner booth with the couple, hadn't joined the flashlight searches along the riverbank. For them, Michael and Susan were names they'd heard in passing, spoken in hushed tones by parents or grandparents who still carried the weight of the story. The case was a ghost now, lingering in whispers but fading in detail. At the diner, the booth where they'd once sat was filled again with laughter, different couples, different stories. The town had moved on, new shops had opened, old businesses closed. Families who had been central to the community drifted away, replaced by strangers who didn't know the history. Even the police department had changed. Younger officers had taken over, men and women who hadn't been alive when Michael and Susan vanished. To them, the case file was just a stack of yellowed papers in a dusty cabinet, a puzzle without pieces. But for the families, time hadn't dulled the loss. Susan's mother still kept her daughter's room, as it had been lace curtains, neatly folded quilt, books lined on the shelf. She grew frailer with each passing year, but the rituals remained. The porch light on at night, the photo of Susan by the bedside, a voice sometimes whispered aloud in the quiet house, "Come home, baby." Michael's younger brother, now an adult with a family of his own, carried the memory differently. He spoke about Michael often, telling his children stories about the uncle they'd never meet. He admitted later that part of him always looked for the Impala on long drives, scanning the road for a flash of pale blue, even decades later. The rumors never fully stopped, but they came less frequently. Every few years, a caller would claim to have seen something: a blue car abandoned in a barn, bones found in a wooded area, a confession muttered by someone on their deathbed. Each time, hope flickered. Each time, it was extinguished. By the 2000s, the case was mostly relegated to local lore. Teenagers whispered about it on late-night drives, daring each other to park by the river where Michael and Susan were last rumored to be. Some swore they saw headlights in the trees, phantom beams that flickered and disappeared. Others claimed they heard voices in the current, laughter carried downstream. The story became less about two real people, and more about the haunting legend of the town. For those who had been there in '69, the fading memory cut deep. They remembered the frantic search parties, the vigils, the posters stapled to poles. They remembered the tears of two families begging for answers, and it hurt to watch younger generations treat the story like a ghost tale rather than a wound. To them, it wasn't folklore. It was Michael. It was Susan. Two kids who should have grown old, who should have had weddings, children, lives that stretched long beyond a summer night. But in the silence, in the absence of answers, people did what humans always do. They filled the void with myth. Every once in a while, anniversaries brought brief flickers of attention. A newspaper would run a small piece. 30 years later, still no answers. A local TV station would interview the surviving family members, their voices trembling with age but steady with conviction. "It's like they just disappeared," Susan's mother said in one such interview, her eyes still sharp despite the lines etched deep into her face. "But I know my girl didn't just run away. Something happened to them, and I won't stop waiting until I know what." Her words struck the town for a moment, pulling the story back into memory, but soon enough, the rhythm of everyday life drowned it out again. By the 2010s, most assumed the case would never be solved. Time had a way of convincing people that mysteries stay buried. If the car hadn't been found in 40 years, why would it ever surface? If the river hadn't given up its secret, maybe it never would. Families aged. Parents passed away. The people who remembered Michael and Susan firsthand dwindled each year. The story lived on mostly in fragments now. A high school history teacher used it to explain how fragile life could be in small towns. A local author wrote about it in a book on unsolved mysteries of the Midwest. A handful of online forums debated theories late into the night. But for the most part, Michael and Susan were no longer two real kids. They were a legend. And then, 55 years after the night they vanished, the river changed. A drought hit the region, draining the water to levels not seen in decades. Rocks long buried surfaced. Fallen trees cracked through the mud. And then, something else appeared, something that looked at first like a shadow, but in the right light, revealed the shape of rust and steel. A car. And just like that, The story wasn't folklore anymore. It was real. It started with the drought. The summer was long and dry, the kind of season that turned lawns to dust and cracked the earth in the cornfields. Streams dwindled to muddy trickles, and even the river, always wide, dark, and restless, seemed to shrink back from the Sunday. Its waterline dropped lower each week until its ribs of stone and sandbars stuck out like bones. For most, it was an inconvenience. Fishermen grumbled about fewer catches. Farmers worried about irrigation. Children who usually swam near the shallows kicked through mud instead. But for one man, a fisherman named Henry Collins, the low river exposed something he could not ignore. At first, Henry thought it was nothing unusual. From the bank, the shape beneath the water looked like a log, dark, long, blurred by the current. But as the afternoon light shifted, cutting deeper into the river's surface, the edges appeared too clean, too straight. It was metal, not wood. Henry waded in for a closer look. When his foot struck something solid under the mud, he froze. He crouched, brushed with his hands, and felt it. Cold steel, curved like the roof of a vehicle. His chest tightened. It couldn't be. Not here. Not after all these years. The sheriff's office responded within the hour. Deputies stretched yellow tape along the bank as word spread through town. By evening, a small crowd had gathered, whispering, pointing. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better look. Teenagers clustered in groups, half excited, half frightened, their voices dropping low as if they were standing at the edge of a grave. Some speculated it was an old farm truck washed downstream. Others thought maybe it was a stolen car, dumped in the river long ago. But the oldest among them, those who had lived through '69, felt the truth settle in their bones before a diver even entered the water. It was the car. It had to be. The dive team arrived the next morning. They suited up silently, heavy gear clinking as they tested tanks and masks. Onlookers huddled close, though deputies urged them back. The divers slipped into the water with soft splashes, bubbles breaking the surface as they descended. The crowd held its collective breath. Visibility was near zero. Years of mud and silt clouded the river, swallowing the divers' lights after only a few feet. They moved by touch, gloved hands brushing along slick surfaces until they found the roof. Rusted, pitted, but unmistakably the body of a car. Minutes stretched like hours before one diver surfaced, mask lifted, face grim but certain. It's a vehicle. ID. The murmurs rolled through the crowd like thunder. Pulling it free was no easy task. Chains had to be threaded beneath the chassis, a delicate process that risked tearing the car apart if the balance wasn't right. A tow truck rumbled into place on the bank, its engine growling as steel cables snaked down into the water. The crowd pressed closer, straining to see through the shifting current. At first, the Impala resisted. Decades of mud clung to it like a grave, suction holding it fast. The winch whined, cables taut, mud bubbling at the surface as the river fought to keep its secret. The driver adjusted the angle, revved the truck harder. Chains groaned, water foamed, and then, slowly, impossibly, the car began to rise. The first glimpse broke through the water like a nightmare surfacing. A corner of the roof, coated in muck, the curve of a wheel well, the slanted line of a shattered windshield. As it emerged, people gasped. Mothers clutched, children tighter. Elderly men and women whispered prayers under their breath. When the full body finally broke the surface, water poured off in heavy sheets, weeds streaming from the windows like hair. The once pale blue paint was nearly gone, eaten by rust, but under the grime the shape was undeniable. A Chevy Impala. Michael's car. Silence fell. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. For some in the crowd, it was like seeing a ghost made flesh. For others, it was the confirmation of a truth they had spent their whole lives whispering about. The Impala was rolled onto the bank, its tires collapsing into the mud. Investigators moved in quickly, cordoning the area, brushing away debris, documenting every angle with cameras. And then they opened the doors. The smell hit first. Damp, metallic, the scent of rot sealed away for decades. Silt spilled out in clumps, leaves and river weeds sloughed off the seats. And inside, tangled in the wreckage, were bones. 2 sets. Small, fragile, incomplete, but undeniably human. The discovery confirmed what many had feared but never wanted to admit. Michael and Susan hadn't run away. They hadn't started a new life. They hadn't been kidnapped and spirited off to some unknown place. They had been here, in the river, all along. Reporters arrived within hours. News vans lined the road above the bank. Cameras captured the muddy car, the yellow tape, the stunned faces of onlookers. Headlines spread beyond the county, beyond the state. Couple missing, since 1969 found in sunken car. For the town, it was surreal to see their ghost story turned into national news. For the families, it was overwhelming. Relief tangled with grief in ways words couldn't fully express. Michael's brother said quietly to one reporter, "We always hoped. We prayed for something, anything. Now we know, but it doesn't make it easier." Susan's surviving cousins echoed the same. "It feels like closing a book you never wanted to finish. We begged for answers, but now that we have them, it just hurts." Yet the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How had the car gone unseen for so long? The river had been dragged in '69. Hooks and nets had scraped its bottom. Boats had combed its surface. Volunteers had stood knee-deep in the current, searching for any sign. How could a whole Impala, a car over 17 feet long, have been missed? Some experts said the answer was simple. Cars don't just sink. They drift, they roll, they bury themselves in mud. Each year, the current could have pushed the Impala deeper, covering it with layers of silt until it disappeared. Only when the drought dropped the waterline low enough did it finally peek through again. But others weren't so sure. Retired deputies swore they had searched that exact spot. Old-timers muttered that the car had been hidden, maybe even moved. Whispers returned to old suspects, old grudges, old names that had never been cleared. The river had given up its secret, but not its truth. For the community, the moment was both closure and fracture. People left flowers at the bank, candles flickering along the mud where the Impala had been dragged. Children asked their grandparents about the summer of '69, and for the first time, the elders told the story not as rumor, but as fact. Teachers added it to lesson plans. Local historians collected photographs. And yet, in quiet corners, doubt lingered. Some said they saw headlights on Miller's Road at night where no car should be. Others swore they heard laughter by the river, voices too faint to place but too clear to ignore. A few believed the river hadn't given up everything, that some part of the story was still submerged, waiting. In the end, the Impala's recovery was not an ending. It was a beginning, the start of new questions, new pain, new theories. Michael and Susan were no longer missing. But they weren't truly found either. Because finding the car answered where, it didn't answer how or why. And in mysteries like this, sometimes those are the questions that matter most. When the Impala broke the surface, it was more than a car emerging from the river. It was 55 years of silence being dragged into the sunlight. For half a century, people in town had whispered about Michael and Susan, traded theories, and told their story as if it were half legend. But now, there was nothing mythical about the pale blue Chevy dripping mud on the riverbank. It was real, it was here, and inside it, the answers everyone had begged for and feared waited. The recovery itself was painstaking. Divers worked first, slipping into the dark water, their flashlights cutting beams through silt that rose like smoke with every movement. Visibility was nearly zero. They had to feel the car more than see it, tracing rusted edges, testing the stability of the frame. Chains were lowered from the bank, looped under axles that groaned under pressure. It wasn't just pulling up a car, it was coaxing out an artifact that had been sealed in place for generations. When the tow truck engaged, the river resisted. Mud sucked at the tires. The Impala shifted, tilted, then lodged itself again. The winch whined, cables taut as bowstrings. Spectators on the bank held their breath. Then, with a surge, the car rose free, shedding water in sheets, weeds, streaming like hair from the windows. As it cleared the surface, people gasped. Some clutched one another. Others simply stared, mouths open, eyes fixed. A few older residents wept quietly. For them, this wasn't just an old car. It was the night they'd never forgotten, breaking through time and forcing them to remember every detail of that summer in '69. The Impala was barely recognizable from the car that Michael once polished to perfection. Its once sleek frame was corroded, patches of rust pocking every surface. The chrome trim, once so carefully shined, was eaten away. The windshield was gone, shattered long ago. The tires, deflated and split, sagged against the rims. But there were still traces of the car's identity. A faint hint of blue paint beneath the rust, the outline of a steering wheel still intact, the silhouette of the Impala unmistakable. Investigators knew immediately. This wasn't just a car, this was the car. Inside, the river had left its mark. The interior was filled with layers of muck, leaves, and branches. Seats had rotted into skeletal frames. The dashboard was warped, gauges fogged with silt. A purse lay on the floorboard, its leather stiff and cracked but still recognizable as a woman's bag from the era. In the back seat, a wallet was discovered, swollen with water damage, its contents fused into an unrecognizable lump of paper. And then there were the bones. 2 sets, tangled and fragile, resting where Michael and Susan had been trapped. Over time, water had scattered some fragments. Teeth remained, enamel glinting faintly under the forensic lamps. Long bones were retrieved carefully, catalogued with reverence. Even half a century later, the remains told the truth everyone had dreaded. Michael and Susan never left the car. The remains were taken to a state forensic lab, where scientists began the delicate process of identification. DNA, unheard of in 1969, was now the gold standard. Samples from the bones were compared to swabs from surviving family members. For Michael, his younger brother provided a reference. For Susan, distant cousins stepped in. Weeks of analysis confirmed what the town already knew in its bones. The Impala held Michael and Susan. The official announcement was somber. Press conferences were held. Photographs of the recovery were released to the media. Headlines screamed across the state. Vanished couple found, after 55 years. But with the answer came a new question. What exactly happened that night? Forensic examination of the car itself was the next step. The Impala's exterior showed no obvious signs of collision, no crumpled panels, no deep impact dents that would suggest another vehicle forcing it off the road. Investigators noted corrosion patterns consistent with decades underwater. The undercarriage was heavily rusted, but there was no clear evidence of tampering. Inside, no weapons, no bullet holes, no signs of overt violence were found. The skeletal remains bore no obvious trauma that could survive 50 years of water. No shattered skulls, no knife marks on bone. To forensic eyes, the case leaned heavily toward a simple but devastating conclusion: accident. And yet, doubt lingered. How could the car have been missed in '69 when the river had been dragged repeatedly? Retired officers insisted they'd scoured that stretch of water, combed it more than once. One said in an interview, "We dragged hooks across that section of the river for days. If that car was there, we'd have found it. I don't know what to tell you, it wasn't there." But water is deceptive. Cars don't always sink cleanly. Some drift with the current before lodging. Some bury themselves deeper each year, swallowed by mud until they vanish beneath the riverbed. For modern experts, that was the most logical explanation. The Impala hadn't been invisible. It had been buried. Still, conspiracy whispers grew louder. Had someone hidden the car? Had it been dragged back into the river after the initial searches? Was there someone in town who had known the truth all along? For the families, the accident theory was both comfort and torment. On one hand, it made sense. A sharp curve, a dark road. Maybe Michael lost control. Maybe the car slid off and was swept under before anyone could see. It was tragic, but it was explainable. On the other hand, it was too simple, too easy. Could 2 careful young people really just vanish that way? Could a community really search so hard and still miss them? Michael's brother voiced what many thought. It doesn't sit right. They were looking right there. They dragged the river. How do you miss a whole car? Susan's relatives, though grateful for closure, echoed the doubt. We're glad to have her home, but we'll never believe it was just an accident. Something happened to them. Something we'll never know. For investigators, the case could only go so far. Without evidence of foul play, without proof of another vehicle, another person, another cause, the ruling leaned toward accident. That became the official conclusion. But the town wasn't convinced. Old names resurfaced in conversation. The drunk from the bar, the jealous ex, the mysterious hitchhiker. Even 50 years later, their shadows still loomed, tangled in rumor and suspicion. And though nothing tied them to the car in the river, nothing could fully erase them either. For some, the Impala's recovery was closure. For others, it was the reopening of a wound. At the riverbank, People left flowers where the car had been pulled. They lit candles, whispered prayers, touched the mud as though it were holy ground. Teachers told the story to students who had only known it as rumor. Old-timers who once rolled their eyes at ghost tales now admitted they felt haunted by how close the truth had been all along. The river, it seemed, had kept its secret until it was ready. But as much as the Impala revealed, it left just as much hidden. Was it truly an accident? Or had 55 years of water washed away evidence of something darker? The answer, investigators admitted, might never be known. The funerals were unlike anything the town had seen in decades. For 55 years, Michael and Susan had been frozen in time, remembered only in photographs and whispered stories. Now, they were here again, not in the way anyone wanted, but present nonetheless. Their remains, carefully prepared by forensic specialists, were finally returned to the families. 2 caskets sat at the front of the church, side by side. They weren't the polished mahogany you might expect for a funeral, but simpler, plainer, a reflection of how little was left to bury. Inside were fragments, bones softened by water, pieces of clothing that had somehow survived the current. Still, the symbolism mattered. After all these years, Michael and Susan were home. The church was packed. People who hadn't stepped foot inside in years came to pay their respects. Elderly residents leaned on canes, remembering the frantic days of searching. Younger faces filled the pews, some who had never known Michael and Susan, but grew up with their story. News cameras were kept outside, but their presence was felt. The world beyond the town wanted to see how a community said goodbye to 2 of its lost children. The service was heavy with silence. Hymns rose from the choir, voices trembling with emotion. A pastor spoke of patience, of unanswered questions, of the cruelty of time. He reminded everyone that grief wasn't measured in years, but in love. And in that church, the love for Michael and Susan was still raw, still alive. Susan's cousins read a poem she had once written for a high school assignment, found folded in an old notebook her mother had saved. Michael's brother spoke about teaching his own children how to fix cars, how every time he opened a hood, he thought of the sibling who should have been there beside him. By the time the service ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. At the cemetery, the crowd gathered beneath a wide oak tree, its leaves rustling in the late summer wind. The caskets were lowered slowly, side by side, as if even in death, Michael and Susan could remain together. Family members clutched hands, tears slipping quietly down weathered cheeks. One elderly neighbor whispered, "They should have been married here, not buried here." It was the sentiment that hung over the entire day. What had been stolen wasn't just 2 lives, it was decades of milestones, weddings, anniversaries, children, laughter at family dinners, stories told around holiday tables. 55 years of living had been replaced by 55 years of absence. And now, finally, the story had its end, but not the one anyone had hoped for. The town held a memorial afterward at the river. People laid flowers along the bank where the Impala had been pulled. Someone tied ribbons to a tree branch, letting them flutter in the breeze. Candles were lit as dusk fell, their flickering light reflecting on the water. The river, once the keeper of the secret, now became the place of remembrance. Speakers talked of resilience, of community, of the cruel lesson that some answers take a lifetime to find. But beneath the words was a current of something else: unease. Because even as the families lowered flowers into the river, even as prayers were whispered, no one truly believed all the questions had been answered. For some, the official ruling of accident was enough. They accepted that Michael and Susan had likely lost control on a dark road, their car slipping silently into the current. It was tragic, heartbreaking, but simple. For others, the ruling felt like a bandage over a wound that could never heal. Too much didn't add up. Too many searches in '69 had come up empty. Too many whispers still lingered in town about jealousy, rage, strangers on the road. For them, closure wasn't closure. It was just the end of hope for answers. In the weeks after the funerals, the town began to settle back into its rhythm. The diner filled with laughter again. The church bells rang on Sunday mornings. Children played along the sidewalks. But every time someone passed the river, every time headlights swept across Miller's Road at night, the memory of Michael and Susan stirred again. Parents told their teenagers to be careful, not to linger out late, not to end up like the couple who vanished. And though the mystery had been solved in one sense, the legend remained. Because closure is not the same as peace. After the funerals, life in town crept forward again, the way it always does. But for those who had carried the weight of Michael and Susan's disappearance, the closure didn't settle comfortably. It pressed down in a different way, heavier, stranger. The couple had finally been laid to rest. The Impala had finally been dragged from the river, but questions, like shadows, lingered. The official ruling was accident, a late-night drive on a dark, narrow road, a missed curve, a plunge into the river. Simple, clean. But people who had been there in '69 couldn't shake their unease. Searches had scoured that very stretch of river, again and again. Patrol logs proved it. Volunteers swore they had dragged hooks through that water for days. Retired deputies said with conviction, "If the car had been there, we would have found it." And yet, there it was, 55 years later, buried in the mud. Then there was the detail no one could explain. Inside the Impala, alongside the bones and the rusted purse, investigators found a wristwatch. It was Michael's, a sturdy, silver-faced timepiece, waterlogged but intact. The hands were frozen in place, stopped forever at 2:17. Some said it was the moment the car hit the water. Others said it was just when the watch finally gave out after years submerged. But the strangeness of it lingered. Why that time? Why so precise? And there was more. A neighbor swore she'd seen the Impala weeks after the disappearance, driving down a back road late at night. She admitted she could never prove it, but the memory stayed sharp. The pale blue car, the shape of two figures inside. For years, people dismissed her. After the discovery, some wondered if maybe she'd seen more than anyone realized. Stories trickled in after the funerals, whispered at kitchen tables, and in hushed tones at the diner. One man claimed his father, on his deathbed, confessed to knowing what happened by the river. But when pressed, the father had slipped back into silence, taking whatever truth he carried with him to the grave. Another said he'd seen fresh tire tracks near Miller's Road the morning after the couple vanished. He hadn't spoken of it back then, afraid, unsure. But now, decades later, the memory gnawed at him. None of it could be proven, but all of it kept the legend alive. Even now, when the river runs low, people stop and stare at the place where the Impala was pulled. Some leave flowers, some leave notes folded into jars, messages for Michael and Susan. Others linger quietly, claiming they've seen headlights flicker on the water or heard voices carried on the current. Teenagers still dare each other to drive Miller's Road at night, to cut their engines near the bridge and listen. Some come back laughing. Others return pale, swearing they heard something they can't explain, laughter, or a cry, or the hum of an engine long gone. In the end, the truth is this: the river gave back the bodies, it gave back the car, but it never gave back the whole story. Michael and Susan were finally home, buried side by side, mourned and remembered. But the haunting detail, the stopped watch, the missed car, the whispers of things seen and unheard, kept the mystery alive. And maybe that's the cruelest part of all. Because some secrets never surface completely, some stories never end cleanly, and some ghosts, no matter how many years pass or how many funerals are held, keep driving the back roads forever.